Hello and welcome. How does a community move forward from tragedy to rebuild lives when they're struggling to rebuild their homes? New Orleans, nicknamed the Big Easy, marks its 5th year since devastating floods nearly wiped it out, but many are still struggling with the restoration effort. Following Hurricane Katrina, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came under heavy criticism for its poorly constructed levee system that left 80% of New Orleans underwater and resulted in around 2,000 casualties. Massive levee reconstruction is underway, but the Army Corps estimates that the system won't be complete until next year's hurricane season. But despite the concerted effort, experts argue that the newly improved levees won't provide the protection New Orleans needs if there's another storm like Hurricane Katrina. So today we ask, are rebuilding efforts moving in the right direction, and how can the city of New Orleans move forward? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Well, I'm joined now by actor Harry Shearer, who's best known for the multiple characters he voices on the Emmy-winning comedy series The Simpsons. As a New Orleans resident, he has a strong interest in his community and has produced and directed a documentary on the events surrounding Hurricane Katrina. The Big Uneasy explores what went wrong on that fateful day in August 2005 when the levees and flood barriers broke. He argues that the media and government description of it as a natural disaster is wrong, and that it was actually an engineering disaster that could have been avoided. Harry Shearer, welcome to the show. Thank you. Tell me about this new documentary that's due out in a couple of days. What's the reason for making The Big Uneasy?
Well, as a New Orleanian, you mentioned, I've been privy to the coverage of the local media as these two independent teams of investigators filled with eminent scientists and engineers dug into the reasons for the flooding after the waters receded. And when President Obama came here last October and called it a natural disaster, frankly, my head exploded, because I realized that this community had lost control of the narrative of its own near destruction. And I'd interviewed the people involved, Dr. Bob B. of UC Berkeley, Dr. Ivor Van Heerden of LSU, and a whistleblower from inside the Corps of Engineers for my radio show. So I figured they had learned to trust me, realized that I wouldn't trivialize the story, and I went to them and I said, I want to make a documentary and I want to tell your story. And so we followed the course of these investigations from the moment they had doubts about the official story to the time that they come up with their findings, and to the consequences for their own lives, which have not been positive.
Now, it's interesting you say when it comes to the Army Corps of Engineers that the right questions are not being asked. What are the right questions, in your opinion?
Well, in a larger sense, the right questions is the United States going about its business of doing water policy, water projects, the right way at all? The Army Corps, we developed this in the film with the help of a journalistic expert on the history of the Army Corps, Michael Grunwald, formerly the Washington Post, now of Time Magazine. The Army Corps does water policy one pork barrel project at a time. That is to say, a congressman says, hey, I'd like this dam in my district. The Corps says, we'll build it. They outsource it to contractors. They're not really engineers anymore, they're contract administrators. And that's the way these projects get built. There's no national water policy. And what happened in New Orleans was sort of a microcosm of that. It was a patchwork of different little pieces of the project. It took 4.5 decades since Congress ordered it, and at the time of Hurricane Katrina, it was not yet complete.
Well, it's interesting. We're going to take a little look at your documentary, an excerpt from there, where you talk about a cover-up.
We know that Katrina was about a 1 in 30 to 1 in 40 year storm.
In fact, New Orleans proper likely experienced only Category 1 or Category 2 conditions.
This is contrary to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who are trying to claim that Katrina was a
1 in 496 probability of occurrence.
The Army Corps generals came out in their green suits and immediately said that
that was a big storm.
The reason they're doing that is to cover their behinds.
And you can't out-engineer Mother Nature.
Part of their defense was this was a humongous storm.
Katrina was a storm that was, until then, unimaginable.
And they seemed to know what they were talking about, so everybody started picking on FEMA instead.
How hard is it to get accountability for all this, Harry? Considering what all those people have said about their sort of assurances and reassurances, it seems that there's no accountability.
Here's the bottom line, and we do develop this fact in the film. There have been no negative career consequences for anybody involved in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in this whole chain of mistakes, misjudgments, and failures. The only negative life consequences and career consequences have come to the 3 individuals focused on in this film who stood up and spoke out. That's not a way to get accountability, to let people just slide and continue. Michael Grunwald, whom you saw there a little bit, says, in fact, that for the Army Corps, failure has historically been a growth opportunity.
It's interesting, I know you say, as you've mentioned there, that it's only the people who really spoke out, the people who've tried to get their voices heard from the official side even, that have actually felt the consequences. I mean, how, from talking to those people, how has it affected them, having spoken out?
Well, Ivor Van Heerden got fired from his job. The LSU Hurricane Center no longer exists. Maria Garzino, the whistleblower from inside the Corps of Engineers, has whistleblower status, which in the United States means that you cannot be fired, but she's been basically given a desk with nothing to do for the last 3.5 years since she started this process. And Dr. Bob B. is, while a very distinguished and eminent professor who's now leading a study into the Deepwater Horizon disaster, is shunned by many of his colleagues who call him an enemy of the United States. So none of them have had a good time.
When you were putting this together, of course, you have a vested interest. Being someone who's there, part of the community, communicates with those who live in New Orleans and have been through all this. But when you made the documentary, who did you have in mind? Who is this documentary for?
Well, it's for the rest of the world. It's mainly for Americans, but certainly for everyone else who was tuned into the story 5 years ago. These images went around the world. And I think the American media, and because the rest of the world media was sort of getting the material from the American media, just failed to ask one simple question as all these images of suffering and death and destruction rocketed around the world at the speed of light. And the question they failed to ask was why. And that's why a guy from show business had to come in and do this 5 years later and to finally ask and try to answer the question, why did this happen? And the answer is, it was a series of engineering misjudgments, mistakes, and miscalculations that stretch back 4.5 decades under administrations of both political parties. And the agency that did it wrong that time is charged with doing it again.
Now, sadly, you know, the sort of follow-on is often left out. It's the media's fault as well. We don't tend to follow up beyond a certain stage. But when it comes to the consequences, when it comes to getting some kind of result from your documentary, what do you hope will come out of it then?
Well, I hope that New Orleans regains control of the story of its own disaster. I hope that the American people realize that this was not a stupid city where it shouldn't be built and an act of God. This was an important major port city placed exactly where it should be, which had been promised protection, and the agency that had promised to protect it instead nearly destroyed it using our taxpayer dollars, and that maybe the United States, at the very least, is going about water policy in an antiquated way that is not suitable to the 21st century.
Interesting you raised that. I want to put an email we got from a viewer in the a viewer by the name of Marie-Christine Durkin, who wrote in saying about the vulnerability issue, isn't it known that New Orleans is situated in a danger zone for hurricanes?
New Orleans has been surviving hurricanes for 300 years. Hurricane Betsy, which hit this city in 1965 and which stimulated Congress to order this protection system, Hurricane Betsy flooded 20% of New Orleans. Now that we had this new protection system, 80% of the city was flooded.
It's interesting you talk in the documentary about the pumps that are supposed to protect the city not being tested properly. Let's listen to that.
When I would bring up the issues to higher command levels that we have problems, I was constantly being corrected by the contractor who would call New Orleans personnel and state that they thought those requirements were too stringent, saying, no, we're fine, everything is fine, we know what we're doing. These types of assurances were false to me and hollow. They weren't based in any real type of technical expertise or know-how. Because none of the testing went as planned and a contractor was not addressing these in a manner that was reasonably suitable, I was asked to not leave until we actually had a successful test. Well, we never had a successful test, so I simply asked to return to Los Angeles because I was useless.
Harry, there, of course, Maria Garzino, you mentioned the whistleblower who paid the price for speaking out like that. Now, why do you think that those tests were not done properly?
I'm not competent to judge why the Army Corps behaves in that way. I can lay out the facts as we know them and let people draw their own conclusions. What I can say is it's not just New Orleans. More than 100 cities have levee systems built by the Corps supposedly to protect them, and the Corps says there are problems with them, and people from inside the Corps point particularly to Sacramento, California. If Sacramento has a problem, all of California south of Sacramento has a problem, because that's where the water comes from. Right. So it's clearly not just a New Orleans problem.
It's interesting, we had a couple of emails that touch on who should lead in terms of the real recovery, or making sure that the recovery is complete. I'll read you these two emails back to back, if I may. The first is from a viewer by the name of Hajra Salim, who wrote in saying, Louisiana needs full federal support of the US government in order to fully recover. And the second one's from Chris Siebenalla, who says, the Katrina effort must be a Louisiana-led recovery. Federal rights and responsibilities are limited by the US Constitution and therefore cannot solely be a federal issue. What do you think? On whose shoulders does this responsibility fall?
Well, look, we've had 5 years of a ground-up grassroots recovery. This city has recovered one house at a time, one business at a time, because individuals, their families, their neighbors, volunteers from around the country, every once in a while an insurance company, every once in a while a recalcitrant compensation program run by the government has helped out. This has been one of the great grassroots recoveries in the history of disasters. But the United States Congress tasked this federal agency with the job of protecting us from hurricanes. It's not, we can't go build these systems. We're not allowed to. Congress has said that's a federal responsibility. It's also the federal government has basic responsibility for two decisions that have enabled the coastal wetlands, which are our support system, the cypress swamps that used to surround New Orleans to the south, that buffered and batted down the intensity of incoming hurricanes. Those wetlands are eroding at the rate of a football field an hour. That takes a federal commitment to rebuild. We can't do that on our own either.
Now, before we take a break, a couple of things. I want to read out an email, just a comment that's interesting, that came in from Riz Khan in the Netherlands, who says, as long as the US continues to spend billions of dollars on war, it will continue to be a long road to rebuild New Orleans. Now, we're going to take a very short break here. When we return, about 100,000 New Orleanians remain displaced, and we'll look at the fight to bring them home. But as we leave you, here's how some of the people of the Big Easy rate the way the city is being rebuilt.
I think that they're going at the pace that they have to go. By that meaning that, of course, they're developing the downtown area first, and so I think that it looks real good down here in the quarters and downtown, but when you look to areas toward the lower ninth and areas to where the people actually lived and were displaced, I think that's going real slow.
The populated areas of the city are really starting to come back, and there are some outlying areas that probably could use some help, but the city's, you know, functioning again as it should.
Is it going at the pace that it could be, possibly at this time, considering labor, material, the finances? Yeah, unfortunately, I wish that it was going faster, but it's getting there. I'm encouraged.
It's embarrassing in this great country that it looks that way, that they haven't done anything. And then when you turn on the news and you read the stories and you hear how many billions from the Road Home Fund still haven't got dispersed to the people, nah, it's like, you know, the politicians are getting their money and it was all a big pushover, but nobody's taking care of the real people down here. My opinion, it's embarrassing.
Welcome back. There you heard some of the people of New Orleans expressing their views on how the rebuilding efforts are going. My guests to examine the issue involved are actor Harry Shearer, who's behind a new documentary, The Big Uneasy, which looks at how the disaster could have been prevented. The film opens across the US on Monday. He's in New Orleans with Tracy Washington from the Louisiana Justice Institute, a non-profit organization working to create social justice for the poor and communities of color. And we get back to our questions. Tracy Washington, 5 years on, how bad is the situation? How many people are still affected?
Well, I suppose in some way or another, all of us are still affected, to the extent our most marginalized folks in our community have not returned home or are home and are still suffering horribly the effects of Katrina. We're all affected. Now, Harry's right. There has been rebuilding, and you can drive in the city and you can see areas that are doing well. But those areas that I think the nation and the world saw, the lower Ninth Ward, Gentilly, Pontchartrain Park, St. Bernard Parish, we see spotty recovery at best. And I think that's why so many folks are questioning, for example, where have all the recovery dollars gone?
Right. Tracy, an email that came in from a viewer by the name of Stephen Hope, Stephen, thanks for sending this in, says, some areas of New Orleans are better off now than they were before the hurricane. We must take notice of the progress that has been made. And I wonder, in the effort to find, some blame or to be able to blame failures, is there a tendency to overlook the successes?
No, and I suppose I beg to differ with the person who sent the email. I don't know any areas that are better off than they were prior to Katrina. Look, we all need to celebrate the successes we've had. We need to celebrate the folks who've been able to come back and have been able to recover. We celebrate the new people that we have in our community. We've been enriched in this community by the infusion of folks from all over the country, all over the world. But I still want those 100,000 people who've faced tremendous barriers in being able to return to their homes and their communities. I would like to see them, and they have every right to return to this community. And our failure has been removing the barriers that have made it impossible for them to return.
Harry Shearer, let me ask you one thing. Obviously, an issue that came up a lot was that this is a race issue, that because the population affected was largely the African American population, that it shows the racial divide in the US very strongly. To what degree do you feel there's a genuine argument there to be put forward?
I think, as so often the case in the United States, race in the national discussion tends to be a substitute for class. The working class people in St. Bernard Parish, the entire parish had its housing stock wiped out. They didn't get on TV. They suffered tremendously too. I think this ends up being, everybody got whacked by the flooding. When 80% of a city goes underwater, it's no respecter of any of these lines. But obviously people with resources had an easier time of recovering than people who are, just getting by. I want to make one point to add to what Tracy says about those 100,000 evacuees. I've asked, and there is no answer to this question. We don't know where they all are, how many of them like where they are now, and how many of them want to come home. We don't have that information as a base to start with. And there's all sorts of anecdotal stories. People know somebody. I have a friend in the housing department here in New Orleans who says her phone rings off the hook every day with people who want to come home. But we don't have the hard data to build a policy around. And that's shameful. Now,
Tracy, of course, your organization is looking to make sure there is social justice and try to represent some of these people. To what degree are you finding it that a lot of these people who are marginalized are finding it very difficult to get representation, to get their voice heard? And what's being done, certainly from your organization, for example, to help that?
Well, we've had tremendous assistance from nonprofits and NGOs and legal advocacy organizations from all over the country, like Advancement Project, the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, Center for Constitutional Rights. So those folks have been able to come in and supplement, for example, legal services that we just don't have the capacity here to resource. And it is a struggle. I mean, many of our professionals did not return, and so many folks are having a real difficult time. For example, with Road Home, now even much more recently, compounded by the BP disaster, getting the real needed representation.
Right. Harry Shearer, to what degree have you seen, or how have you seen the impact directly of Hurricane Katrina on your community? Has it helped to bring people together more, or do you think it's showed the divide more?
In terms of the flooding, I think we've gone through a period where the politics tended to divide, but yet on a day-to-day basis, I think people have reached out to help each other. New Orleans is an extremely tight-knit community. That's one of the reasons that the disaster hit so hard. It's not a city of atomized individuals, and when families and neighborhoods were ripped apart, that really was a much bigger harm to this community than it would be to a more individualized modern city, modern in quotes. And I think the real job is to reweave that tapestry that is the essence of this city.
Now, Tracy Washington, I know there's the word that's used a lot with New Orleans is resilience. You know, it's a resilient city. I know you don't like that term. Explain why.
I don't, you know, it's fine for what it is, but I tell folks all the time, I don't want to be called resilient anymore. Resilience just leads people to think, well, you can load some more crap up on me and I'll be able to take it. Well, call me dainty. You know, maybe if you treat me or perceive me to be a person who needs to be handled with kid gloves, you will stop piling stuff on me and ensure that the resources, and I say this for all the folks who are still so desperately in need of resources, ensure that the resources that are needed, be it levees, be it schools, be it hospitals, are provided and get here. So yeah, I'm not resilient.
Harry, I've only got about 10 seconds. I just wanted to check with you. You're keeping an eye on the way the levees are now being rebuilt and what's going to happen in the future, aren't you?
Yes, by talking to the people who really know and are keeping an eye on it. Bob B. says that the factor of safety in the new system is the same as the factor of safety in the old system, which is less than is used for rural dams.
Right.
That's worrisome.
Harry Shearer, Tracy Washington, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to stay tuned to Al Jazeera for continuing coverage of the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina starting on Friday. And remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. Give us your feedback on topics and post your questions and comments. On the next show, tens of thousands of people are classified as disappeared. As human rights groups pause to mark the International Day of the Disappeared, we look at how so many people can remain unaccounted for and why enforced or involuntary disappearance is still a risk today. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.